My husband looked straight at our 15-year-old son and said, "That uniform doesn't mean anything anymore." He said it in court, not in our kitchen, not during a fight, not in a moment he could later blame on anger. He said it in front of a judge, 2 attorneys, a custody evaluator, his mother, and the boy I had raised almost entirely on my own. Then he looked at Caleb like he expected him to agree. But Caleb didn't speak. He only reached into his jacket pocket, and when I saw the folded letter in his hand, my stomach dropped. Because I had hidden that letter inside my army uniform 10 years earlier. I wrote it for Caleb when he was 5. I planned to give it to him when he turned 18, and I never imagined he would find it 3 days before the hearing that could take him away from me. My ex-husband, Mark Whitaker, stood beside his attorney in a gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. His mother, Evelyn, sat behind him in the gallery wearing pearls, her hands folded neatly in her lap, calm in the way powerful people look when they believe the room already belongs to them. For 2 hours, they had described me as unstable, too military, too rigid, too damaged. Mark's lawyer had not shouted once. That made it worse. He spoke softly, like a doctor explaining a difficult diagnosis. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "has built her entire identity around past service and unresolved injury. We believe Caleb needs a home where he is not constantly reminded of sacrifice, trauma, and guilt." I sat still. My attorney, Grace Holloway, touched the edge of my legal pad with one finger, a reminder to wait. I had waited for 12 years. I could wait a little longer. Then Mark's lawyer placed a photograph on the screen. My dress blue jacket, the ribbons, the nameplate, the careful row of medals I almost never touched. "This," he said, "hangs in the hallway of Mrs. Whitaker's home." "It hangs in a closet," I said. He smiled, but visible to Caleb. When the closet door is open, Evelyn gave a small sigh behind him, just loud enough for the judge to hear. Then Mark stood and looked at our son. "That uniform doesn't mean anything anymore." Caleb's face changed. Not much, just enough for me to see the boy inside the teenager. His jaw tightened, his eyes lowered, his hand moved slowly into his jacket pocket. He had brought the letter. The one I had hidden because I did not want him growing up inside my pain. The one that explained why I came home injured. The one that said what his father had spent years trying to erase. I wanted to stop him. I wanted to protect him. But my son unfolded the paper with shaking hands, and Mark's face finally lost its confidence. To understand why that one folded piece of paper could silence a man who had spent years rewriting my life, I have to go back to the beginning. Not to the courtroom, not to the custody papers, back to the woman I was before all of them decided my scars were useful. My name is Rachel Whitaker. Before I became the woman sitting in that courtroom, I was Captain Rachel Monroe, United States Army Nurse Corps. I was not famous. I was not the kind of soldier people made documentaries about. I did my job. I trained medics. I treated injuries. I learned how to stay calm when everyone else had a reason not to. Then I married Mark Whitaker. At first, he made me believe ordinary life was possible. A quiet house, a baby asleep in the next room, a husband who waited for me to come home. That was all I wanted. Mark came from a wealthy family in Nashville. His mother, Evelyn, was the kind of woman who could insult you while holding your hand. She never said she hated my military career. She only called it intense. She never said I was not feminine enough. She only said Caleb would need a softer kind of mother. When Mark and I were newly married, I used to laugh those comments off. Then I noticed Mark never corrected her. "She means well," he would say. Every time, when Evelyn said military wives should learn when to step back, Mark said, "Mom means well." When she asked whether deployments made women emotionally hard, Mark said, "You're overreacting." When she told me motherhood should become my only mission, Mark smiled and said, "Not everything is a military operation." At first, those were small cracks. The kind you step over because you still believe the floor is solid. Then deployment orders widened them. Caleb was 3 months old when I was assigned to a medical support mission overseas. Mark did not yell when I told him. He went quiet. That quiet lasted for days. One night, while I folded Caleb's clean clothes, Mark stood in the nursery doorway and said, "So that's it?" I looked up. "What?" "You just go. I have orders. You have a son. I know that. Then act like it." The onesie in my hands was so small I could fold it inside one palm. "I am acting like it," I said. I am doing my duty. And then I am coming home. Mark looked at Caleb's crib. My mother was right. I waited. He said, "You always choose the uniform first." I should have understood then that he was not afraid of losing me. He was angry that my life had a part he could not control. I left believing I would come back to a hard conversation, maybe a wounded marriage, maybe a husband who needed time. I did not know I was leaving behind a family already rehearsing how to blame me for surviving. The mission changed 2 months in. Our medical unit was sent to support a civilian evacuation after a series of attacks near a transport corridor. We treated soldiers, contractors, parents carrying children, old men who kept apologizing for needing help. On April 17th, our convoy was hit. The first explosion stopped the lead vehicle. The second came while we were pulling people out. I remember dust, heat, someone screaming my name, a little girl missing one shoe, a nurse trapped behind twisted metal. I was ordered to evacuate twice. I did not leave until the people under my care were moved. By the time they got me to the helicopter, I had shrapnel in my shoulder, a fractured wrist, hearing loss in my right ear, and nerve damage in my left leg. When I woke up in Germany, I had 14 missed calls from Mark. The first voicemail started with anger. "Rachel, your mother called me before the army did. Do you know how embarrassing that was?" I replayed it. I thought medication had twisted the words. It had not. The second voicemail was worse. "My mom says we need to talk about Caleb. I can't have him raised around trauma." I was lying in a hospital bed with tubes in my arm, and my husband was already turning my injury into a custody concern. When I was transferred back to the States, Mark came to see me. He brought white lilies. Evelyn had picked them. He stood at the end of my hospital bed, looking at my leg brace, my bandaged shoulder, my shaking left hand. His first question was, "How long are you going to be like this?" I stared at him. "I don't know yet. My mother thinks Caleb should stay with us until you're stable." With us? At her house. I tried to sit up too quickly. Pain tore through my ribs. "My son is not moving into your mother's house. You can barely stand. I am still his mother." Mark looked away. "No one said you weren't." But he did not need to say it. 2 weeks later, I came home. Caleb's bassinet was gone from our bedroom. His clothes had been moved to Evelyn's house. My medical discharge papers were missing from the folder the army sent home, and the small locked box where I kept copies of my orders and service documents had been opened. Mark said he knew nothing about it. Evelyn smiled and told me pain medication could affect memory. That was the first day I understood they were not helping me recover. They were preparing to explain why Caleb should not stay with me. Still, when you are hurt and exhausted and desperate to hold your child, you do not always call things by their right names immediately. Sometimes you call control help, because admitting the truth would mean admitting how alone you are. For months, Evelyn called it support. She controlled Caleb's schedule, filtered visitors, and even spoke to the pediatrician before I could. If I reached for my own son, she would say, "Careful, Rachel. We don't want you falling while holding him." Always in front of someone. Always softly. Mark went back to work and let her do it. That became his pattern. He did not always have to hurt me himself. He only had to step aside and let his mother do it for him. I learned to walk again while asking permission to hold my own baby. I went from a walker, to a cane, to short distances on good days. At night, after everyone left, I sat beside Caleb's crib and whispered the same thing. I came back. The uniform became an issue after my medical retirement ceremony. I almost skipped it. Colonel Teresa Vance, my former commanding officer, called and told me not to disappear. "You are not attending because you feel strong," she said. "You are attending because the people who served with you deserve to see you alive." So I went. I wore my dress blue jacket for the first time since the attack. My shoulder ached when I buttoned it. My left hand shook when I pinned the ribbons. Mark watched from the doorway. "You really need to wear that? It is a military ceremony. You look like you're trying to prove something." "I'm trying to show respect." "To who?" I looked at him in the mirror. "To the people who did not come home." He said nothing after that. At the ceremony, Caleb slept against my chest, while Colonel Vance spoke about duty, survival, and the strange loneliness of coming home. Changed. Afterward, she placed an envelope in my hand. "What is this?" I asked. "A copy of something you may need one day. I don't want another report." "It is not a report." I did not open it until 3 days later. Inside was a letter from Teresa. She wrote about April 17th, about the evacuation, about the nurse I went back for, about the children we moved before the second blast. Then she wrote, "If your son ever hears that your uniform took you away from him, make sure he also knows it is the reason you understood how to come back." I sat on the bathroom floor and cried where nobody could see me. That night, I wrote a letter of my own. Dear Caleb, if you are reading this, it means you are old enough to ask hard questions. I hope I have answered them honestly. I hope I never made you feel responsible for adult pain. I hope you know I chose you every day after I came home, even on the days when standing beside your crib hurt more than I let anyone see. Your father may think my uniform took me away. Your grandmother may think it made me less of a wife. But I want you to know what it meant to me. It meant promises. It meant fear did not get the final word. It meant I learned that you do not leave people behind, because saving them costs you something. And you, my son, were never left behind. Not for 1 second. I folded my letter behind Teresa's. Then I hid both inside the inner lining of my uniform jacket, behind a loose seam near the left pocket. I did not plan to use them. I hid them because I was not ready for my son to carry the truth. For a while I thought hiding those letters was mercy. I thought if I kept enough pain away from Caleb, he could grow up lighter than I had. But pain does not disappear just because you refuse to hand it to a child. Sometimes it waits in the walls. Sometimes it waits in other people's mouths. Mark left when Caleb was 3. He did not slam the door. He did not make a speech. He simply became less present until his absence felt normal. Late meetings, weekend conferences, phone calls outside. Then, one Thursday evening, while I was rinsing shampoo from Caleb's hair, Mark walked into the bathroom and said, "I filed." I looked up. "Filed what? For divorce?" Caleb splashed bathwater onto the floor and laughed. That sound almost broke me. Mark talked while I wrapped our son in a dinosaur towel. He said we had grown apart. He said my injury had changed the house. He said he could not live forever under the shadow of my service. Then he looked toward the hallway closet, where my uniform hung inside a garment bag. "You never really came back from the army," he said. I held Caleb tighter. "I came back with nerve damage and a cane. That is not what I mean. I know exactly what you mean." Evelyn arrived 30 minutes later, with a folder already prepared. She sat at my kitchen table like she owned it. "We have to think about Caleb," she said. "We? Mark needs stability. Caleb needs stability. You need time to heal. I have been healing while raising him." Evelyn gave me a sad little smile. "Surviving is not the same as mothering." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was true. Because she said it like she had been waiting years to use it. The first custody agreement gave Mark joint legal custody and flexible visitation. Flexible meant he could cancel. Flexible meant Evelyn could pick Caleb up when Mark was busy. Flexible meant I still handled fevers, school forms, dentist appointments, nightmares, lunches, permission slips, birthday cakes, and every ordinary thing that never appears in court unless someone writes it down. So I wrote things down. Every missed visit, every late pickup, every email from Evelyn trying to change Caleb's records, every message from Mark saying, "Something came up." I did not do it because I wanted revenge. I did it because I had already seen what happened when people called my memory unreliable. Years passed in the way hard years do. Not all at once. Morning by morning. School form by school form. Fever by fever. Birthday by birthday. And slowly, without applause, Caleb grew into the kind of boy who noticed when people were hurting. Caleb grew tall. He became careful, kind, and too observant for his own good. He loved history. He read biographies of soldiers and civil rights leaders. He volunteered with me once a month at the Veterans Center, refilling coffee cups and listening to men twice his size talk softly about pain. Mark noticed him again when Caleb won a statewide essay competition. The essay was called "The People Who Come Back." He never wrote my name in it. He did not have to. 2 weeks later, Mark asked for more time. Then overnight visits. Then school access. Then his attorney sent a petition requesting primary custody. The petition said Caleb needed a broader social environment, stronger academic networking, and a home not centered around unresolved military trauma. Mark never sounded cruel on paper. He sounded worried. That was what made it dangerous. I sat at my kitchen table that night with the petition spread in front of me, and for the first time in years, I felt the old fear come back. Not battlefield fear. Not the kind that makes your body move. This was slower. The fear that someone could take the life you rebuilt and describe it so carefully that strangers might believe it was broken. Grace Holloway read the petition in silence. She was my attorney, a former JAG officer with silver hair, sharp eyes, and a voice that never wasted volume. When she finished, she tapped one paragraph with her pen. This is the center of their case. I looked down. My military trauma, my physical limitations, my supposed emotional rigidity, my alleged use of guilt to control Caleb. Evelyn's affidavit was worse. 12 pages. She described me as cold, controlling, unstable, and obsessed with military identity. She wrote that Caleb seemed afraid to disappoint me. She claimed the uniform was displayed in my home like a shrine. Grace looked up. Is it displayed like a shrine? It hangs in a closet beside winter coats. Grace stared at the paper again. She is very committed to this lie. Yes. Grace leaned back. We answer with documents, not anger. I know. No text to Mark, no confrontation with Evelyn, no emotional posts, nothing they can use. I know. She studied me for a moment. Rachel, is there anything in your military record they can twist? I almost smiled. They are already twisting it. I mean anything we do not know. I gave her VA evaluations, therapy records, rehabilitation records, employment letters, Caleb's school forms, calendars, and years of messages. Still, doubt got in. That is what a good false story does. It does not have to become true. It only has to make you wonder whether other people might believe it. One night, I found Caleb standing in the hallway, looking at my uniform bag. The closet door was open. He touched the sleeve through the plastic. Mom? Yes? Dad says you would have chosen the army over us if you could. The sentence hit harder, because Caleb did not sound angry. He sounded confused. I stepped closer. What do you think? He looked at the jacket. I don't know. I wanted to tell him everything. About the hospital. About the missing documents. About Evelyn. About Mark's first voicemail. About the letter hidden in that jacket. But he was 15. Old enough to understand. Still young enough to be injured by the wrong version of the truth. So I said, "You are allowed to ask me hard questions. Will you answer?" Yes. Did you leave because you wanted to? No. Did you come back because of me? I touched his shoulder. I fought to come back because of you. He nodded, but his face did not relax. Then he asked, "Why does Dad sound so sure?" That was when I got scared. Not because of the court, because my son had started to wonder whether the person who stayed had somehow been the one who left. I thought I could manage the case with records, calendars, and controlled breathing. I had done hard things before. I knew how to sit across from pressure and not blink. But this was different. This was my son's face changing when his father spoke. Grace called Colonel Teresa Vance before I was ready. I did not want my old commander involved in my custody fight. I did not want my worst day turned into an exhibit. But Teresa arrived at Grace's office on a Monday morning, wearing a dark jacket, and the same expression she used before inspecting a failing unit. She read Mark's petition, then Evelyn's affidavit. By the time she reached the phrase emotionally unstable due to military conditioning, she took off her glasses. Did Mark ever read the after-action report? I don't know. Did he know you were recommended for a Valor Award? He knew there was paperwork. That is not the same thing. I was busy raising a toddler and learning stairs again. Her expression softened. Then she asked, "Where is the letter I gave you?" I looked away. Grace noticed. "What letter?" "It is personal," I said. Teresa's voice sharpened. "Rachel." I hated that tone, because it meant she already knew I was avoiding the obvious. "It is inside my uniform," I said. Grace blinked. "Inside?" "Sewn into the lining. With a letter I wrote for Caleb." Grace leaned forward. "You sewed 2 letters into the jacket they are now using as evidence against you? When you say it that way, it sounds worse." "No," Grace said. "It sounds important." I promised to bring the jacket the next day. I did not. Not because I was hiding it, because I was afraid. Once those letters came out, Caleb's childhood would split into before and after. 3 days before the hearing, his school held a Veterans Appreciation Dinner. Caleb had been chosen to read his essay. He wanted my father's old tie. While searching for it, he opened the hallway closet. The garment bag slipped from the hanger. The jacket fell partly open. The old seam near the inner pocket tore. Both letters dropped onto the floor. I was in the kitchen when I heard him go quiet. Not a sound. Just the absence of sound. I walked into the hallway and found my son sitting on the floor, holding the envelopes. His face was pale. "Mom," he said. I knelt too fast and pain shot through my leg. "I can explain. You wrote this when I was 5? "Yes. Why didn't you give it to me?" "Because you were 5. His eyes moved across Teresa's letter. "She said you refused evacuation." I said nothing. "She said you went back for a nurse and 2 children." I swallowed. "She said they ordered you to leave." "Caleb, Dad said you chose the army." My voice barely came out. "I chose to come home." He pressed the paper against his chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I did not want your love for me to depend on hating him." For the first time in years, my son cried like a child. I held him on the hallway floor beside the jacket everyone had tried to turn into shame. That night, Caleb took a photo of the last paragraph of Teresa's letter and sent it to Mark. "You knew she came back for me. Why did you lie?" Mark did not answer for 14 minutes. Then he wrote back, "Your mother has always been good at making herself look noble." Caleb showed me the phone with shaking hands. And just like that, Mark gave us something he could not explain away. Proof that he had seen the letter and still chose to call it manipulation. For a moment, I wanted to believe that would be enough. A cruel message, a hidden letter, a son who had finally seen what I had tried to carry alone. But court does not run on feelings. It runs on what can be admitted, challenged, authenticated, and believed. Grace moved quickly. She copied the letters. She contacted Teresa. She requested the after-action report, the medical review, and the psychological fitness evaluation, connected to my retirement. Then the delays started. The military records office said one file had been archived under my maiden name. Another needed authorization. A third had a redacted section that required a separate request. Mark's attorney objected to using Teresa's letter, calling it emotional and prejudicial. Grace warned me the judge might not allow the recording Caleb had made later. "There are rules," she said. "Even when the truth is on our side, rules matter." That scared me more than I admitted, because on paper, Mark's story looked cleaner than mine. He had money, a large home, a mother who volunteered at charity boards, a lawyer who knew how to make cruelty sound like concern. I had a limp, a government job, old wounds, and a teenage son who had just discovered adults had lied to him for years. The first documents that arrived were not enough. The commendation recommendation was strong, but Grace said the court might see it as old history. The psychological evaluation helped, but Mark's lawyer argued that it did not reflect my current parenting. The old emails were ugly, but one of them was vague. Evelyn had written, "This may help later if Rachel becomes difficult. Judges listen when children are involved." Grace frowned at it. "It shows intent, but not enough by itself." Then we found the reply. Mark had written, "She will never fight hard enough. She hates looking unstable." I read that line in Grace's office and felt my hands go numb. Grace gave me a minute without saying the words. Then another email arrived. From Evelyn to Mark, dated 2 weeks after I came home injured. "Do not let her keep full copies of the deployment documents at home. She will use them to make herself look heroic." Mark replied, "Already handled the box." Grace looked at me slowly. "The locked box?" "Yes." He denied knowing anything. "Yes. Now he can deny it under oath if he wants to destroy himself." But even then, Grace was careful. "This helps," she said. "It does not guarantee anything." The custody evaluator's report came next. It was mixed. That frightened me. She wrote that Mark's home was financially stable. She wrote that Caleb could benefit from a stronger relationship with his father. She wrote that Evelyn appeared deeply invested in Caleb's future. I felt sick reading that phrase. Then Grace turned the page. The evaluator also noted that Caleb became tense when Evelyn answered for him. She noted that Mark could not name Caleb's current doctor, his therapist, or the teacher who supervised his award-winning essay. She noted that Caleb said he felt safest with me because I answered hard questions without making him feel guilty for asking. That helped, but Grace still warned me. "The judge will want to hear from Caleb if we rely too heavily on this." "No. Rachel, no. He has carried enough." Grace's face softened. "I know. But Mark made him part of the case when he claimed Caleb felt pressured by your service." I looked out her office window at the courthouse across the street. For years, I had protected Caleb from the truth. Now the truth needed him. That felt unfair. And it was. I spent that night sitting at the kitchen table after Caleb went to bed, staring at a folder full of proof and still feeling afraid. That is the thing people do not always understand about evidence. It can be solid and still not feel like safety. The recording happened 2 nights before the hearing. Caleb was ordered to attend dinner at Mark's house. 4 hours. No overnight. He did not want to go. I made him, because the court order said I had to. He came home too quiet. When Mark's car left, Caleb handed me his phone. I recorded something. My stomach tightened. Were you unsafe? No. Did anyone threaten you? No. Grandma just forgot I had my phone on the table. We sat together at the kitchen counter. He pressed play. At first, there was only the sound of silverware. Then, Evelyn's voice. You understand. This is very hard on your father. Caleb said nothing. He is trying to give you a future your mother cannot provide. Mark muttered. Mom, leave it. Evelyn did not. She has always used that uniform to make people feel sorry for her. Caleb's voice was low. She got hurt. She embarrassed this family, Evelyn said. My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. Then Caleb asked, Did you know about Colonel Vance's letter? Silence. Long enough to matter. Mark said, Where did you find that? In Mom's jacket. You had no right going through that. It was addressed to me. Evelyn's voice sharpened. She was never supposed to keep that. I stopped the recording. My chest felt tight. Caleb whispered, What does that mean? I pressed play again. Mark said, Mom, stop. But Evelyn was angry, and angry people often forget strategy. I told you years ago to get rid of those papers. If that colonel had kept her mouth shut, Rachel would not have spent a decade acting like a saint. Mark said, Enough. No. That uniform should have gone in the trash with the rest of her army nonsense. Caleb's voice shook. You took her papers? Evelyn answered. Your father protected you. Mark said, Caleb, turn that off. The recording ended. Neither of us moved. Then Caleb said, They knew. Yes. The whole time? Yes. His eyes filled, but he did not cry. His face did not look innocent in the same way anymore. He had heard enough to understand that this was not a misunderstanding. Mom? Yes. I want the judge to hear it. I wanted to say no. Children should not have to become witnesses because adults lied. But Caleb looked toward the hallway closet, then back at me. Dad said your uniform meant nothing, he said. I think it means he lied. By the morning of the hearing, I had slept less than 2 hours. Caleb ate half a piece of toast and said he was fine, which meant he was not fine at all. I wanted to keep him home. I wanted to take the whole case off his shoulders. But the machine was already moving, and all I could do was walk beside him. The courtroom smelled like old paper and floor polish. Mark arrived with Evelyn. He wore the gray suit. She wore cream. They looked calm. Grace leaned toward me. Do not watch them. I'm not. You are. I looked down. She was right. Mark's attorney opened first. He described me as loving but limited. He used that phrase twice. Loving but limited. He said Caleb deserved opportunity. He said Mark's home offered stability. He said my service deserved respect. But Caleb should not grow up emotionally responsible for my sacrifice. Evelyn dabbed her eyes at the perfect moment. Then Grace stood. This case is not about opportunity, she said. It is about whether a father who has been inconsistently present for 12 years can use a mother's service injuries as a reason to remove a child from the only stable home he has known. Mark stared straight ahead. Grace continued. We will show that Mrs. Whitaker has been Caleb's primary parent in every meaningful way. We will show that the allegations of instability are unsupported. And we will show that Mr. Whitaker and his mother knew the meaning of Rachel's service record before they tried to twist it. Mark's attorney objected. Judge Hale looked at Grace. You will need to prove that. Grace said. Yes, Your Honor. Mark testified first. He was convincing. He spoke softly. He said he admired me. He said he worried Caleb had become my emotional caretaker. He said, I want my son to have a childhood that is not built around wounds. It sounded beautiful. That was the problem. Then Grace cross-examined him. Mr. Whitaker, what is Caleb's current doctor's name? Mark blinked. I would have to check. What is his history teacher's name? He has several teachers. The teacher who supervised his award-winning essay. Mark shifted in his chair. I do not recall the name off the top of my head. When was his last therapy appointment? I was not informed of therapy. Grace looked down at her file. Mark quickly added, Rachel handled most of those things. That was part of the problem. She kept me out, then used my absence against me. It was the first answer that sounded like him, calm on the surface, blaming me underneath. Grace lifted one page. Email dated March 3rd. Mrs. Whitaker sent you the appointment schedule and invited you to attend. You replied, handle it your way. Is that accurate? Mark looked at the paper. Then, at his attorney. Then, back at Grace. Yes. Grace let the silence sit. Then she asked about the uniform. You testified that Rachel uses her uniform to pressure Caleb. Yes. Has she ever told him he must join the military? No. Has she ever required him to attend military events? No. Has Caleb ever told you, in any words, that his mother makes him feel guilty with her uniform? Mark's jaw tightened. I know my son. Grace nodded once. That was not my question. He did not answer. Then Evelyn testified. She was polished. She said she loved Caleb. She said she had only tried to help me. She said my injury made me defensive. She said the uniform had always made the family feel like they were not allowed to question me. Grace stood. Mrs. Whitaker, did you remove documents from Rachel's home after she returned from deployment? No. Did you advise your son to dispose of Rachel's military papers? Absolutely not. Did you ever say the uniform should have gone in the trash? Evelyn's face tightened. I do not recall. Grace looked at the judge. We will return to that, Your Honor. For the first time, Evelyn looked toward Mark instead of the judge. That look told me something. She was still confident, but she was no longer comfortable. And in that room, comfort was everything. Mark and Evelyn had walked in expecting the story to stay in their hands. They had not expected the facts to start answering back. Colonel Teresa Vance testified after lunch. She did not wear a uniform. She did not need to. Grace asked about April 17th. Teresa described the convoy, the evacuation, the injured civilians, the trapped nurse, the orders I refused until the people under my care were out. She did not exaggerate. That made it harder to hear. Grace asked, did Captain Monroe display impaired judgment? No. Emotional instability? No. What did she display? Teresa looked at the judge. Protective discipline under extreme pressure. The kind of judgment you want, when lives depend on someone making the right decision, while injured, afraid, and running out of time. The room went still. Then Grace introduced the official evaluation. Mark's attorney objected. Judge Hale overruled him. The petitioner has placed Mrs. Whitaker's military condition and emotional stability at issue. The court will consider records directly responsive to those claims. The judge read silently, page after page. Then he stopped and removed his glasses. Captain Monroe refused medical evacuation until all personnel and civilians under her immediate care had been moved to safety, he read. Subsequent command and psychological evaluations found no evidence of impaired judgment. Evaluators noted exceptional emotional regulation, self-command, and decision-making under severe physical injury and operational chaos. Nobody spoke. Judge Hale looked at Mark. Mr. Whitaker, your petition suggests your former wife's service history indicates instability. This record says the opposite. Mark swallowed. I was not aware of the full language. Grace stood. Your Honor, we would like to introduce written communication showing Mr. Whitaker was aware of the existence and significance of these documents years ago. The emails came next. Evelyn's warning. Mark's reply. Already handled the box. Judge Hale read them twice. Then Grace asked to play the recording. Mark's attorney objected immediately. Grace argued that Caleb had been present in the conversation and that the recording was relevant to credibility and intent. Judge Hale paused long enough for my heartbeat to fill the room. Then he allowed it for limited purposes. Caleb went pale. The recording played. Evelyn's voice filled the courtroom. She embarrassed this family. If that colonel had kept her mouth shut, that uniform should have gone in the trash with the rest of her army nonsense. No one moved after the recording ended. Evelyn's face lost its color. Mark closed his eyes. Judge Hale spoke quietly. Mrs. Whitaker Sr. Evelyn lifted her chin. That was taken out of context. The judge stared at her. I would advise you not to continue. She closed her mouth. Then Caleb asked to speak. I turned toward him. Grace did too. The child advocate whispered something to him. Caleb nodded. Judge Hale said, "You understand you do not have to say anything." "Yes, sir. You may speak." Caleb stood with the folded letter in his hand. "My dad told me my mom chose the army over me," he said. "My grandma said the uniform made her selfish." His voice shook, but he kept going. I believed some of it because they sounded so sure. Mark started to speak. Judge Hale raised one hand. Caleb unfolded the paper. "Then I found the letter my mom wrote me when I was little. She never showed it to me. She never used it against Dad. She hid it because she did not want me to hate him." He looked down and read one line. "You were never left behind. Not for 1 second." His voice cracked. Then he looked at the judge. "My mom walks slower than other people. Sometimes her hand hurts, but she never made me feel like a burden. Dad came back when I started winning awards. Mom was there when nobody was clapping." I covered my mouth with one hand. Caleb turned toward Mark. "You said her uniform meant nothing." He held up the letter. "It meant she came home." That was the moment Mark stopped looking like a man with a plan. He looked like a father who had finally heard his son say the part everyone else had avoided. The judge did not rule immediately. Maybe that was mercy. Maybe it was procedure. All I knew was that when he called a recess, my legs felt weaker than they had all morning. Caleb sat beside me in the hallway. After a while, he leaned his head against my shoulder. "I'm sorry I read it before you gave it to me." I looked at him. "I'm sorry you needed it before I was ready." Across the hall, Mark stood alone. Evelyn sat several seats away from him, stiff and silent. They looked nervous in different ways. For the first time, neither of them seemed sure the story would hold. When court resumed, Judge Hale reviewed the evidence slowly. My parenting record, Mark's missed involvement, Evelyn's interference, the military evaluation, the emails, the recording, Caleb's statement. Then he looked at Mark. "This court does not doubt that you love your son in some capacity. But love that becomes urgent only when a child becomes impressive is not the same as parenting." Mark lowered his head. The judge continued. "You attempted to frame Mrs. Whitaker's service injuries as proof that she is less capable. The record does not support that. Her history shows consistency, medical compliance, employment stability, and a long pattern of placing Caleb's needs first." He turned a page. "Primary custody shall remain with Mrs. Rachel Whitaker." I closed my eyes. Just for 1 second. Grace touched my wrist. Judge Hale was not finished. "Mr. Whitaker will have visitation under a structured reunification plan, guided by a family therapist. He is not to discuss this litigation, Mrs. Whitaker's service history, or adult grievances with Caleb." Then he looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Whitaker Sr., pending further review, you are not to have unsupervised contact with Caleb." Evelyn opened her mouth. Judge Hale did not raise his voice. "I strongly suggest you accept that instruction silently." She did. After 12 years of polished cruelty, Evelyn finally had nothing to add. Outside the courthouse, Mark approached us. He looked smaller without his mother beside him. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. For once, I believed him. I answered, "Start by not asking Caleb to carry your shame." Caleb looked at him. "Did you really know about the letters?" Mark's eyes filled, but he did not look away this time. "Yes." "Then why did you lie?" For a long moment, Mark said nothing. He looked toward the courthouse steps, then down at his hands. "Because if I admitted what your mother did," he said, "I would also have to admit what I didn't do." Caleb waited. Mark swallowed. "I was angry at her for needing me to be stronger than I was." That was the first honest thing he had said in years. Caleb nodded slowly. "I don't forgive you yet." Mark wiped his face. "I understand." "No," Caleb said. "I mean yet." That word did not fix anything. But it meant Caleb was not ready to forgive him, and he had not shut the door completely. After the hearing, people expected me to feel victorious. I did not. I felt tired. I felt relieved. I felt like someone had finally stopped standing on my chest. But victory is too simple a word for what happens when your child learns the truth and wins safety at the same time. There is gratitude in it. There is grief too. Caleb needed time. Not speeches. Not pressure. Time. He went to therapy. Some weeks he came home quiet. Some weeks he asked questions I wished I could answer better. I told him the truth when I had it, and when I did not, I said, I don't know. Mark started showing up. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but consistently enough that Caleb noticed. He learned his teachers' names. He attended counseling. He stopped letting Evelyn speak for him. That did not earn instant forgiveness. It earned the right to keep trying. Evelyn sent Caleb a birthday card with a check inside, and no apology. He mailed it back with one sentence: I need words before money. As for the uniform, it no longer hangs forgotten in the hallway closet. Caleb asked if we could frame copies of the two letters. Not for visitors. For us. So we did. Colonel Vance's letter, my letter, and a small photograph from my retirement ceremony. Caleb asleep against my chest, his tiny fist resting against the jacket everyone later tried to turn into shame. The real uniform is stored carefully now. Not hidden, not displayed like a shrine. Protected. Caleb once told me, Dad was wrong. It didn't mean nothing. I asked him what he thought it meant. He said, it meant you came home. I think about that often. Mark said my uniform meant nothing, because it no longer gave me rank. Evelyn said it belonged in the trash, because it reminded her of a woman she could not fully control. The court called it evidence. My son called it proof. To me, it was never about medals. It was about a promise. Do not leave people behind. Not on a battlefield. Not in a hospital room. Not in a childhood. Not when walking hurts. Especially then. If you've ever had someone twist your silence into guilt, tell me in the comments. Do you think Rachel should have shown Caleb the letter sooner, or was she right to wait? The end.